The period we're talking about is called the High Middle Ages. Europe's population doubled between the years 1000 and 1300. I'll not write that down, but it was a fairly prosperous time for Europe. They had better farming techniques for one, and that made crops grow better. And folk, again, I can't emphasize this enough, another thing they had a really, really hot climate. That meant more crops could grow, and the crops could grow better. It was a warm period, a prosperous time. Now, one of the things they invented was the Karuka. The Karuka is a type of plow. It was a really heavy-duty plow made out of iron, and it was drawn at first by teams of oxen, but then they wound up using horses because horses were faster. And they would put like anywhere from 10 to 20 horses to a team. You know, it wasn't just like 2 horses. I mean, it was a big team of horses. And you might say, where did they get their horses? Well, basically, all the farmers would get together, and Farmer Jack would loan his horses to Farmer Joe and Farmer Billy, and this whole community would get together and they'd plow maybe Farmer Jack's field today. And then after they'd plowed Farmer Jack's field today, they'd turn around tomorrow and plow Farmer Joe's field. And Farmer Joe would use his own horses plus the horses of everybody else in the neighborhood. And they would get together, like I say, a big team of horses. And the plowing was done, and because it takes a lot of time to turn 20 horses around, they would plow in long strips that would look like strips of bacon you see from an airplane. Turn around and plow in another long strip, and then turn around and plow. They plow in long strips. They practiced not just 2-system crop rotation, but 3-system crop rotation, where that they would plow this year, they'd plant A and B. The next year, they'd let lay A and lie fallow and plant B and C. Then the following year, they would plant A and C. But the land would lie fallow at least once every 3 years. By rotation also, they would plant a different crop on the same ground each year, which is still a good idea even into these days of modern fertilizers. Some crops will catch a parasite and start to catch it one year, but then if you grow a different crop, these parasites oftentimes cannot grow on a different crop. Like a tomato parasite often won't grow on a pumpkin, or vice versa. So they would plant different crops on different fields, or let fields lie idle. They got a lot of iron in those days. Again, the iron was used for plowing, among other things. But also iron was used for to make swords and armor. The iron might have come from Africa. We don't know, have the records for sure, but Africa has played a bigger role in world history than we realize it. But the Africans would oftentimes mine the iron and then smelt it down into iron and then sell it across the desert, and it would sometimes find its way into Europe, or is believed to have found its way into Europe. The iron was used to make hammers and nails, tools. Now, how many of you know what a scythe is? All right, one of you, yeah, one of you, okay. A scythe is like a big sickle, the sickle part of it is about this long, and you operate it with a handle down here and hold the other end here, and you can twist your back pretty badly operating it all day, but it was used to cut wheat and corn. I used the word scythe one time and didn't realize most of you are probably city folk. My dad had a scythe when I was growing up, and I would sometimes use it. It's a heavy tool to operate, to say the least. It's like a sickle, but much bigger, and you operate it standing up. But they would make scythes. Again, they would cooperate with each other. Now, all this spirit of cooperation, community, loaning each other their horses, taking turns, plowing each other's field, all this was eventually to come to an end. But during the High Middle Ages, between better climate, better methods of produce, they were able to eat pretty well. Now, the farms at this time tended to be owned by individual farmers, not by collective. The communists have tried collective farming in the 20th century, particularly the Soviet Union and China, with the result that millions of people starved. A collective farm is a farm where the land is owned by the state, and everybody in the community is expected to pitch in. And when you harvest, all the harvest goes to the state, then the state redistributes it according to how much everybody needs. That's in theory. In actual reality, a whole lot of people do not get redistributed to and they starve to death. This you'll talk about. But these farms, though, were privately owned. The land was tend to be privately owned. Again, that was to change. A typical farmer, much too often, will have to borrow the money in the spring to plant his garden, and then get deeper in debt during the summer, keep borrowing. Then come harvest time, he can pay off his loans and have nothing left and have to borrow again to start all over and keep doing this year in and year out. And all it takes is one bad year. The bad year can be caused by a storm or by a blight, a lot of times caused by war. These people had some wars going on, even though they had fewer of them. But an enemy could come in and destroy his crops. One bad year and he loses land. You might say, why couldn't he save up money and get ahead to save for a rainy day? Well, you'll find, if you haven't already, that's often easier said than done. But a lot of times they would lose their land, and eventually the land found its way to a big rich landlord, as was the case of so many societies down through history. All right. About the horses, they learned how to put the harness on a horse's shoulder instead of his neck. Now, if you can imagine a horse pulling a heavy plow with a harness around his neck, I mean, there was a limit to how much you could pull. Then they put the harness down on the horse's shoulder. He could pull maybe 2, 3, or 4 times as much as he could have with a harness around his neck. Again, the Chinese had done this before the Europeans. We don't know if the Europeans learned it from the Chinese or if they simply invented it and figured it out themselves. But this made the horse a lot more productive. I read in a joke book one time that horses would have the last laugh if they could see human beings being strapped to a shoulder harness. Today, the horses go free while humans are strapped to a shoulder harness. At one time, the horses were strapped to a shoulder harness, while the humans... Anyway, that's another issue. Also, the iron horseshoe came into widespread use, and this enabled a horse to pull a heavier load than he otherwise could have. The iron horseshoe would stay on the horse longer and protect the tender part of his foot more. They began to harness the power of water. As a stream would flow down a hill, they would put a water wheel on it and get the water wheel to turn, and this was how they supplied the power they used to grind their wheat into flour. This is done at a grindstone, and they'd also sharpen their plows, sharpen their scythes or sickles and their other tools, cutting tools, their swords, using a grindstone that oftentimes was turned by a water wheel, or the grindstone might have been turned by a windmill. They built a lot of windmills during this period of time. And you may or may not be aware if a windmill is coming back in style. You go to certain places in the country, you see a lot of them. Windmills are being used to generate electricity. It's not a dependable form of electricity now, however, because the wind doesn't always blow, and it doesn't always blow at the same speed, but you can get some electricity from windmills. More and more land was being cleared, which meant more land was available for farming. Swamps were drained. Now, I want to say this about draining swamps. In this country now, that is illegal. In fact, I think it's illegal in much of the Western world. Our governments want our swamps to be reserved for wildlife. And if you happen to build your house on a wetland, the government finds out about it, woe be you. But wetlands are now preserved. But During the time period we're talking about, swamps were drained. When I was a kid, our books would brag how that in the South they were draining the swamps and making more land available. This is now frowned on and looked on as being damaging to wildlife. We want to keep our swamps swampy. But the Europeans at this time were draining the swamps. Serfdom. At times during this period, serfdom increased, and at times it decreased. The economy went up and down. A lot of farmers might have one bad year and be forced back into serfdom. Also, the landlord controlled particularly the windmill or the water wheel, and for a serf to have his hose sharpened or his axe sharpened or a scythe sharpened, he'd have to pay the landlord a fee. Because of the monotony of farm life, they had numerous feast days where they would celebrate. They would celebrate at Easter, at Pentecost, and of course at Christmas, and at Midsummer Day. There's to name a few. They often consumed a whole lot of ale. In other words, for those of you who don't know, ale is an alcoholic beverage. And Europeans became really strong consumers of alcohol. And what this was to lead to was a whole lot of accidents due to drunkenness. Yes, they would take risks while drunk that they would not have taken had they been sober. And a lot of them died rather horrible deaths, oftentimes from falling off a scaffold while working up high. Again, taking a risk they would probably have known better than to take if they had been sober. Now, I've had more than one student do papers on drinking during the Middle Ages, or drinking in Europe. When the Industrial Revolution occurred, Europeans felt like they had to curb their drinking because factory owners did not want, drunken workers operating their machinery, and still don't. And I know at Lockheed sent more than one worker home while I was there because they felt like he'd had too much the night before. And they would oftentimes call a taxi and say, "Here, you take the taxi man, you take him home. When he's sober enough, he can come back and get his car." But they sent more than one person home who had the problem. Cities grew, but the cities in Europe never were, and at least did not get as big as the cities in the Muslim world or the cities here in the Byzantine Empire in this part of the world. But European cities did grow a little bit. All right, time went on. Towns would receive a charter. That is, the towns would then would get independence from a local lord. And this became a way of life for a lot of towns. Water in Europe became very polluted, and that partly because of the population increase meant that people dumped their garbage in the water. Now, folks, I don't know how it is today, but I've been told that the European rivers are still so polluted that you cannot drink from them, so you have to drink purified water of a sort, or a lot of Europeans simply drink wine still, or drink something else besides the water. That the water in Europe is still undrinkable owing to hundreds and hundreds of years of dumping all kinds of waste in it, human waste, animal waste, and garbage into the rivers. The rivers became polluted in Europe and have remained so to this day. People then had to drink from wells. In the towns, they had public baths where people would go to take their baths until eventually the plagues closed them down. All right. They learned crafts, and some of these crafts took many years to learn. So you had 3 levels: apprentice, journeyman, and master. And some factories in our country still have these ranks. The apprentice was the beginner. Now, he would often start as young as 10 years old. When he turned about 17 or 18 to become a journeyman. The apprentice, he was the one who ran errands for the master, maybe go and collect the master's food or just all kinds of errands, but he would watch the job being done and eventually learn the job. The journeyman, he was more serious about the job. He would start at 17. He was a paid helper, unlike the apprentice who was unpaid. The journeyman was paid. And the master, he was able to form his own business and join a guild. Guilds are similar to our unions. It was where that they, like for instance, maybe all the cobblers in a town would get together and form a guild, and they would make sure that they stayed in business. Anybody who was not a member of the guild was to get out of business. They did not want competition. So in effect, these cobblers would tell the community, if the shoes that you buy have our name on it, then you can know you're buying quality shoes, because we see that all of our guild members can make quality leather and quality shoes. And what they do, the guild everybody who was a member of the guild would put his shoes on the market, and they'd all share the profits. That way nobody was put out of business, and unless they all were. But they were guaranteed that nobody would get ahead of anybody else, for one thing. And they were similar to a trade union. Trade unions do the same thing, guarantee that all workers are paid equally. But it has a good effect in that some workers are not underpaid, but bad in that some workers who might deserve to be paid more aren't. You had guilds for shoemakers, guilds for weavers, guilds for blacksmiths, any other trade that you could have. They would get together and form these unions. Fairs were a big part of, and still are. Fairs would be held about 5 or 6 times a year, and fairs are where people would get together, take off from work, and go and oftentimes drink a lot. That's true, but they would go with a lot of money to spend and spend a lot of money. It was a place where the persons who made stuff could go and sell their wares, and we still have them. Get entertained, and it was said that the priest always got really busy when the fair was over, because people would come into him confessing all the sins they'd committed during the fair, and it was a busy time for the priest. The fairs became a big part of the life in the Middle Ages. All right, moving on from the life of the average person to the church. During this time, the popes became very, very secular, and they would do things that only a secular prince should have done, that is, by our standards. The popes would lead armies, collect taxes, make treaties, ally themselves with their friends, or ally themselves against their enemies, and do things that only a secular ruler should have done. And their secular duties often interfered with their spiritual duties. In fact, a lot of the popes at this time seem to have had little spiritual mind at all, mostly secular. And this went down all the way from the Pope down through the cardinals, the bishops, archbishops. Oftentimes your cardinals would do the same thing, act like a secular nobleman, and make treaties, form alliances, and lead armies, also go to war against dissenters. So there was little difference at this time between the secular and the spiritual. Monasticism was a big part of the day. Let's see, the most famous monastic of that time was Saint Dominic. He led these Dominican friars. Now, the Dominican friars, among their other jobs, was to combat what they called heresy. Now, heresy, a person who committed heresy was called a heretic. This was anyone who disagreed with the church. Now, it was a very serious matter because oftentimes the penalty for heresy was death. Death oftentimes burned at the stake. And it is said that probably maybe hundreds of thousands of heretics were burned during this time. In a sorted, called holy orders. I really don't know what word used for it, but it was a sorted time. Or another name for holy orders is Inquisition. The Inquisition you'll hear about from time to time. And again, holy orders and Inquisition, the same thing. Where that the Inquisition was where that they would go around, the Dominican friars would go around to a community and inquire, who's a heretic, who's dissenting. And neighbors would often point accusing fingers at each other. And they would round up the dissenters and oftentimes punish them severely, imprison them, or worse, burn them at the stake. Now, about the Inquisition, I have a book at home that was written in the 1920s, and it says that not one of those popes have ever apologized for the Inquisition. Well, one finally did. About 20 or so years ago, Pope John Paul II made what amounted to an apology for the Inquisition. The Inquisition is something that the church today is embarrassed about, and rightfully so. Again, I don't mean to hit the church hard. Every group of people has done something to embarrass themselves. But unlike a lot of other places in the world, in Western Europe at least, the people here could admit their wrongs and could reform. A lot of places around the globe, people could not admit to wrongs and therefore could not reform. Now, with all due respect, the Dominicans did not just fight heresy. They would sometimes help the poor. Now, again, about helping the poor, that was a noble thing to do for them. It's not a noble thing for a king. I mean, personally, I think that kings have no business helping the poor. But for the church, yes. For organizations, oh, definitely yes. Charitable groups, definitely yes. Relatives, definitely yes. For the government, no. But unfortunately, in the modern world, the government is getting more and more involved in trying to help the poor, with the result that they're eventually going to impoverish all of us. All right, the popes. The big problem that the church had was on who was to appoint church officials. Oftentimes the secular lords said we should. The church said no, we should. Eventually, the concordant of, that word is pronounced Worms. I know it's spelled with a W, but you know German. Reached a compromise. It said the church would appoint the government, the church would appoint its own officials, but the lords had to approve of it. In other words, the lords no longer made the appointment, at least directly. The lords could approve or disapprove of the person the church appointed. But basically it said the church should appoint its own officials. And that, to this day, that's accepted. Today, the nobility does not approve of officials' appointments anymore. But today, in Europe, the church always appoints its own officials, and that's still true. The secular nobility does not. The most powerful pope during this time, by far, was Innocent III. Innocent III used the interdict to get his way. In other words, if any realm disobeyed him, any nobleman or any king, he would put that nobleman's or king's realm under interdict. And persons who lived in that realm that was under interdict could expect to lose their souls if if they died while the land was under interdict. This was very terrifying to Europeans, to say the least. Among other things Innocent did, the most powerful king in Europe, King Philip Augustus, wanted to divorce his wife. The Pope sent him a letter: "You do not have my permission to divorce your wife. You may not divorce her. Take her back." And Philip obeyed the Pope and took his wife back. He wanted a divorce. King John, a fairly powerful monarch in London, King John wanted to appoint the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Pope said, "No, I'm going to appoint the Archbishop and you don't." King John had to yield because, again, this Pope Innocent was very powerful. So on and so forth. Those are just two examples. He believed that the Pope should dominate all of Europe's affairs, religious and political alike. Under him, new religious orders came into existence, and under him, the Inquisition was used very, very strongly. And I don't know which Pope actually started the Inquisition. It might have been Innocent, but I believe it was actually around before that time. But he used the Inquisition quite a bit to get his way. And under him and his immediate successors, all of whom were very powerful, him and his successors killed more people, dissenters, heretics, than all the other popes down through the ages combined. He ordered 2 crusades. Don't worry about that so much, but basically, I mean, he was a very powerful pope, to say the least, who got his way. And it has been said around Rome, the city of Rome, he was looked down on. He was a little man and somewhat of a unassuming, and did not have a very commanding personality. So in Rome, he was not respected. But outside in the rest of Europe, he was looked on as being stronger than any of the kings that Europe had at the time. Now, if you see me blushing, folk, I can never talk about indulgences without blushing. Indulgences, the practice of selling indulgences got started this time. Now, here's the story behind indulgences. Initially, they were used to where you would pay to relieve a loved one from purgatory. So in other words, basically if you had a father who had died, and he was a pretty good man, but he had a few little sinful problems, so he committed a few sins in his life, so he's probably in purgatory. Well, you could go to the priest and pay the priest a certain sum of money and free your father from purgatory. But it went on that after a while it got to where you could then buy forgiveness for your own sins, to where basically if you wanted to commit a certain sin, you would go to a priest and you would tell the priest what sin you wanted to commit, and you and the priest would haggle over how much it would cost. I mean, the more money the priest thought you had, the bigger fee he would charge, and also the bigger the sin you wanted to commit, the more the priest would charge. And after you and the priest had agreed on a price for the sin, the priest would write you out a bill of indulgency, give it to you. The indulgency guaranteed you forgiveness for the sin you were about to commit. And both you and the priest knew you were at least going to go out and at least try to commit the sin you had just purchased forgiveness for. Now, if you think, folks, that there's something wrong with the theology, everybody today does too. And even the Catholics will tell you, and I've seen in the Catholic literature, that the sale of indulgences was wrong. Now, if you study second semester world history, you'll learn, if you haven't already, that the sale of indulgences one day bumped head on into a certain man. Anybody know which man I'm talking about?
Henry.
Who?
Henry.
Not Henry. They bumped into Henry VIII wound up dissenting, but they bumped into a certain reformer named Martin Luther. I'm surprised how many college students don't know who he was, but Martin Luther was a German monk who preached hard against and eventually got the sale of indulgences stopped. Martin Luther, you run into him. A lot of persons say that one of the reasons the West became so great was because of men like him. But anyway, sale of indulgences, the church doesn't do it anymore, and perhaps wishes it never had. Anyway, Innocent III would sell them. I want to say this about indulgences also. The really magnificent cathedral at St. Peter's Basilica, where that the Pope lives and where that the churches run from, and where that the cardinals pick the Pope. St. Peter's was built by money from the sale of indulgences. So it was a very, very big business during the period of time we're talking about. All right. Universities were started. Now, the first university that we know of in Europe was started at Bologna, Italy. And then universities spread until north of the Alps. The first one started was at Paris. Eventually one was started at Oxford, England. These universities, by the way, still exist. Now, a lot of persons have wondered how come Europe was a place that Western Europe that's spread out and developed and made a lot of inventions, spread all over the globe and conquered much of the rest of the world. Some people say that one of the reasons was the universities, or that the universities would get the learned men together, and yes, I must say men because only men went to them at the time, but get the learned men together and then get students who were eager to learn, and they would pool all their knowledge in one place. Eventually kings got involved, and the kings would pay scholars, or would set up universities. And I want to say this about, in our American Constitution, there's a clause in the Constitution that allows Congress to set aside funds to make inventions, and to set aside funds for learning, and to set aside a certain amount of land for the setting up of a university. And every state in the Union has a land-grant college and a state college. There's Georgia State, and the University of Georgia, the University of Alabama, and Alabama State, Tennessee's. In the case of Tennessee, the land-grant college and state college is all one, located in Knoxville. But each state has at least 2 universities that it supports, and actually more than that. This college would hardly exist without government money. Again, this was authorized in the Constitution. European kings began doing this many, many generations ago. Universities at first had 3 degrees: the bachelor's, the master's, and for the really good students, the doctorate. To teach at the university, you had to have at least a master's degree. A bachelor's degree meant you were knowledgeable in a field. A doctor's degree meant that you were qualified to express an opinion. Scholasticism. All right, the scholastics. These were again where a bunch of schoolmen would get together, and they would pool their ideas, debates. Well, they debated many issues, a lot of which do not seem to make a lot of sense to us today. But again, they were getting together and thinking, at least. But their favorite topic was Aristotle. Scholasticism was somewhat of a looking backward, believing that the past held the key to knowledge, that past scholars were more brilliant than today's scholars. And folk, if you haven't guessed already by now, you might understand that I somewhat can empathize with them, because I strongly suspect that the past humanity was very, very, very highly advanced. Perhaps more so, and likely more so than we are today. Nevertheless, be that as it may, the scholastics really believed that they were higher, and they would look back to Aristotle, and they would study Aristotle, thinking he held the key. Among other things scholastics dealt with was the conflict between faith and reason. And this conflict, folk, is still going on. It affects all religions, some more than others. It seems to affect monotheistic religions more than it does other religions. Faith and reason, because sometimes it seems like scientific discoveries contradict what the religion has taught, and that's true whether it be Christianity or Islam or even Judaism. Science says one thing, and when the Bible or the Quran seems to say another. But they would try to reconcile faith and reason, and again, this is still going on today. Now, into this scenario came one of the greatest scholars of the Middle Ages, Saint Thomas Most of you folk have probably never heard of him. Again, he has somewhat fallen into disrepute. St. Thomas Aquinas goes down in history sometimes alongside of names like Plato and Newton and Einstein. And you might wonder, what do you have in common with them? Well, quite frankly, not much, except for one thing. These men believed that they could explain the universe. Today we call it the TOE, or the theory of everything. Einstein called it the unified field theory. The idea that one of these days we were going to soon maybe be able to explain the universe. Particularly about the time I was born in 1950, one of the most noted scientists in America wrote an article believing we just about have everything explained. He said we have a theory that explains everything. Now there's some things that don't quite fit our theory yet, but it will. We're just on the verge of being able to explain the universe. Fast forward 65 years here, 2015, and folk, there are some scientists who will tell you and admit that we're actually farther from explaining things than we thought we were 60, 50 years ago. And if anything, some of them are ready to admit that there are some things that simply are not even going to be explained. But Thomas Aquinas believed that he could explain everything, that we could, in fact, he said he could tell you how many angels could stand on the head of a pen, a straight pen. I mean, he could tell you, I mean, he thought he understood everything. Today, of course, we don't think so. And as for our theories, I want to remind you of something you might have or might not have heard. We do a lot with electricity today. But there's one question, if you ever take a course in electricity, don't even ask. You won't get an answer. That question is which direction does electricity flow? At one time we knew, back in 1950 or so, yeah, it flows from negative to positive. Then we invented the transistor. And it undid everything we thought we knew, folk. Today, they say, don't even ask, we don't know. Some say that the voltage flows one way from positive to negative, the current flows from negative to positive, and that's how you get your electricity, with the voltage pulling one way, the current moving the other. But again, we do not know that for sure, and we can't prove it. Basic fundamental question, but guess what? All this stuff that we've invented using electricity, which leads me to my next point. Of all the theories we have about to explain the universe, there's not one theory that doesn't have some compelling reason why it cannot be true. Now, there's two types of science, both the theoretical and the practical. Practical science is where you put this push rod against this valve, and this push rod will move the valve. I'm talking about an automobile engine now. Or the camshaft will move the push rod. Some of you might know what I'm talking about. That's practical. The theoretical, gravity holds the universe together, except for one thing. Newton's theories work inside the solar system. Get outside the solar system, and there's just not enough gravity to hold a galaxy together. So scientists go, well, maybe there's such a thing called dark matter. I was listening to something last night who said maybe it's not dark matter at all, maybe it's electricity, plasma, magnetic attraction, electromagnetism. And folk, that is heresy among scientists. But try to disprove it. I've asked many a class, how much do we know, really know about the universe outside our solar system? And I'll give you a hint, it can be summed up in one word. Anybody know what that one word is? What we really know can be summed up in one word. Anybody have any idea what word I'm thinking of? Nothing. Excellent. I mean, hey, I believe we should study it. I mean, I'm in favor of studying. Believe me, I'm very interested. Then there's the world of quantum. How many of you have heard that quantum particles seem to behave one way when you're observing them? Turn your back to them and these same quantum will behave another way. I mean, I saw one of you jerk your head a little bit. I can understand why. I can document that, folk, if you want me to. Also, a beam of quantum, you shine it for a certain distance and then put a little red film and change the color to red here. Shine another one at right angles. At the same point that the beam turns red over here, that beam will turn red over here without there being any kind of barrier to turning red. Very famous experiment. It said that quantum particles can go from here to here without ever having been anywhere in between. All right, I gotta quit. All right. But in other words, basically what I'm getting at, the point I'm trying to make focus, what we really know about the subatomic world and what we really know about the space outside our own solar system can be summed up in one good word, and that is nothing. But anyway, St. Thomas Aquinas believed he could answer all questions and reconcile all the bodies of knowledge into one big unified body. Latin was replaced with the local language, sometimes called the vernacular. You'll see that word vernacular used if you study medieval history in depth. It means that basically the French people started learning in French instead of in Latin. At one time, to get into college, the college classes were conducted in Latin and the religious service was conducted in Latin. Today, more and more, the vernacular is used and Latin is falling by the wayside. They would use the local language. Cathedrals were built. Now, folk, that may not sound like much, but then some student persuaded me to read a book several years ago that at the same time Europe was building its magnificent cathedrals, in India, the Buddhists were building them too. And a lot of Buddhist cathedrals had a lot of the same characteristics that the European, and they wondered, was there any kind of contact between the Christians on the one hand and the Buddhists on the other? The two types of cathedrals, remember, Romanesque. Your book shows a picture of both. And then the Gothic. The word Gothic has nothing to do with the Goths. The Romanesque cathedrals, they were the ones that had the barrel roofs, in other words, the roof shaped rounded. But because of the shape of the roof, they were dark inside. Tended to be dark inside. But at least, though, you could say this about them, they were sturdy. The Gothic, on the other hand, they had their arches pointing skyward. And everything about a Gothic cathedral seemed to suggest heaven. A whole lot of tall, tall steeples and a whole lot of stained glass. In other words, they were well lit inside. Unlike the Romanesque cathedrals are dark, the Gothic cathedrals, they were light inside. And they had what we call ribbed vaults. In other words, a ribbed, I mean they had one right after the other. And then over here, same thing. They were not rounded barrel, but they were ribbed. But everything about them seemed to be indicating or pointing toward heaven. All right. Okay, we're going to move on to chapter 13. Start off talking about an empire that was a holdover from Roman times, the Byzantine Empire. Byzantine. Now, the Byzantine Empire was located down here in what is today Turkey. Okay, well, right in here, for those of you who can see it, the capital was Constantinople, named after Constantine. When the Roman Empire fell in the west, the Byzantine Empire remained in the east. It eventually called itself the Greek Empire, even though it included Greece. They included, of course, what is today Turkey and Greece. The capital was right in here. Now, the Byzantine Empire early on was led by a man named Justinian. Justinian ruled right about the time the Western world was crumbling. While the Western world was falling into petty kingdoms and small dukedoms, Justinian built up an empire that almost restored the old Roman Empire. He had even the southern part of Italy and Sicily and a lot of North Africa, and he had a huge territory. But his empire did not survive. And 3 years after he died, his empire had fragmented, owing in part to a depleted treasury and to a plague. In those days, plagues would break out. But Justinian is also remembered for his law code. And his laws were used throughout Europe during the Middle Ages. Now, there was one problem a couple of problems the Byzantine Empire had. Number one, they were fighting long, long wars with Persia. When I say long, the wars lasted 600 years. The Persian Empire revived after having been destroyed by Alexander the Great, and it helped to destroy the Western Roman Empire. Here's why. The wars that they fought with Persia were expensive and inconclusive, and they would just keep fighting and fighting and fighting. Finally, a Byzantine emperor decided to be decisive, and he had 3 really strong, hard campaigns in which he destroyed the Persian Empire. Problem was, he weakened his own empire so much that right after the Persian Empire was weakened and the Byzantine Empire, right at that point, the Muslims came out of Arabia and conquered Persia, and eventually, it took a while, eventually they conquered the Byzantine Empire. Constantinople was the largest city in Europe, and it was the last of the cities of the Byzantine Empire to fall when it finally fell. All right. Another problem the Byzantines had, they had a problem with plague, they had a problem with the Muslims, but the Bulgars, a group of people from Asia, Central Asia, basically from Mongolia and Turkestan and they came over. Eventually the Bulgars settled in Bulgaria. They took, this had been Byzantine territory, but the Bulgars came in, settled along this part of the Danube. The Byzantines them, and the fighting went back and forth. Eventually the Byzantines were successful in it. At least they held on to most of their own territory, but the Bulgars settled in within this area here called Bulgaria. Just another one of many groups of Asian people who came in and took over part of Europe. Now, as they went on, they eventually replaced the Latin language with Greek, and they did something else. Well, wait, before it, there is another problem they had, a serious problem, perhaps the worst of all. They never separated church from state. Church and state were one. Unlike in Europe, where the church could sometimes at least argue with the state, and sometimes even win, in the Byzantine Empire, the church became a tool of the state. The emperor appointed all the patriarchs, appointed all the church officials. Local magistrates appointed the lower church officials. The church officials were always appointed by a magistrate. And the result was the church and state became one and the same. What's wrong with this? All right, I want to compare it to our government. Our government, we have three branches: the president, the Congress, and the courts. And these branches hold each other in check. In other words, the president cannot tell a senator how to vote. Now, he can tell his Secretary of State what to do, because that's part of the executive branch. He can tell the Attorney General what to do, but he can't tell a senator or representative what to do, and he can't tell a judge how to make a decision. He can only hope. Well, supposing we get a dictatorship someday, and the president's wound up telling judges how to rule. That would be a true dictatorship, where our president would tell every Senate what bill it must pass. We might have had something like that when Johnson was president. There was a story that a bunch of senators met in a committee, and they looked at a certain bill, and every one of the senators said, except one said, "This bill is rotten, this bill no good." Except one senator got up and made a call to the White House, to Johnson. And Johnson called all the senators to the phone one at a time. And when he did, the bill went through, just rushed right through with no problem. I mean, what kind of influence Johnson had? This story got out that Johnson was telling the senators what to do, which is not at least, well, not what he was supposed to do. But whatever, Johnson became one of the most unpopular presidents we've had in modern times. But anyway, the church was supposed to be the conscience of the state and be independent of the state. Instead, the church became a tool of the state and never once told the state what it could or could not do, or what it should or should not do. And then they shouldn't have told the state what it could not do, but they should have been able to tell the state what it should not do. Now, another problem they had, they eventually split with the Roman Church, and they formed the sometimes called the Greek Orthodox Church, or sometimes called the Orthodox Catholic Church. The Orthodox Church is a lot like the Catholic, with a couple of major differences. Difference number one is they don't recognize the authority of the Pope. They just claim we're independent of the Pope. And difference number two is they do allow some of their clergy to marry. And if a clergyman wants to be an Orthodox clergyman, and he can marry if he agrees to it at first. If he decides to be celibate, he's expected to remain celibate. But he can decide whether he wants to be a celibate clergy or a married clergy. Two big differences. Now, I had a close friend at Lockheed who joined the Orthodox movement, and a lot of people in America have joined the Orthodox. The one thing, though, that I must say about the Orthodox is everywhere where they have been, if Islam hasn't taken over, the communists have. I mean, the Orthodoxy became the dominant religion of Russia, the dominant religion of a lot of this part of Europe, Yugoslavia region. But again, everywhere they've been, where Islam hasn't taken over, communism has. And folk, again, each of you can just try to figure out for yourself why. I don't even really want to speculate on why that is. My friend at Lockheed said, oh, it's because geographically they were located closer to Islam, and they served as a buffer between Islam and the rest of Europe, and they got to fight Islam first, and Islam was never able really to get past them on into Europe. That's why Europe remained independent. That might be part of it. Another part of it, though, was that to fight, they had to tax the people heavily, and they turned a lot of people against them. But be that as it may, they could not separate church from state. And this eventually proved to be their undoing. All right. The Crusades. I'm fast running out of time. I have mentioned the Crusades. Just try to remember there were 4 main Crusades. Altogether, there were 200 events called Crusades, but 4 main ones. The first one was the only success for Europeans. It caught the Islamic world off guard. The second one didn't do much. The third one, the Muslim world got a leader named Saladin. And okay, I will say this. If Islam could get a leader today that all of Islam could respect, like someone who would claim and convincingly claim, I'm the 12th Imam. Have any of you heard of the 12 Imams? I mentioned them here in class once. Suppose the 12th Imam just simply disappeared from history, and he's going to come back someday, and when he comes back, he'll unite all of Islam, and he'll be like their Messiah, and he will take on and conquer the world. If someone would come forth and claim, convincingly claim to be that 12th Imam, and unite them, they could create a formidable opponent for us today. And guess who would supply them the weapons they'd use? It should be anybody know. The United States of America. Unfortunately, that's probably going to be very, very, very true. Anyway, Saladin was a leader who united the Islamic world in his day. And the fourth crusade was the one that it sacked Constantinople and greatly contributed to the destruction of the Byzantine Empire. Ironically, it was the emperor of Constantinople who called the Crusades to begin with. He said to Europeans, "Say, please help me. I can't fight these Muslims. Please come help me." Well, they came to try to help him, but the Fourth Crusade, instead of fighting the Muslims, turned on the Byzantines and captured and held the Byzantine capital for 40 years. Eventually, the Byzantines drove them out, but the damage they had done to the Byzantine Empire was irreparable. And they contributed greatly to the destruction of the Byzantine Empire, which was destroyed. Now, there's another crusade I must mention. I don't think it's in your book, but personally I find this fascinating. The Children's Crusade. Now, folks, if this story sounds fantastic or far out, I'm sorry, but this is true history. Right here in this region of Europe, about 50,000 children went on 2 separate crusades, and these were boys and girls alike. Don't ask me how they persuaded their parents to let them go, but these children said, "We believe that we can do what the adults could not do." And they went in 2 separate groups and marched toward the Holy Land. They never got as far as Constantinople. Every one of the children who participated were either killed or sold into slavery. No significant number of them went home. It just seems like some kind of megalomania hit that part of Europe, or some kind of a religious zeal just hit that part of Europe, and never. Anyway, the Crusades ended in 1290. It began in 1095, so it was a period of 195 years. And one reason it ended in 1290 was in 1307 the Black Death hit Europe, and Europeans were in no shape to dare get together in bands of men and go and fight anyone from abroad. Now, there has been some controversy about the Crusades. Were they good or were they bad? I had a graduate professor at UT who is one among the world's top 5 experts on the Crusades. He even wrote articles that found their way into Encyclopedia Britannica. He showed them to us. I mean, he was quite proud of that. I said, my article on the Crusades. He was an expert, top Harold Fink by name. He's gone now. What good did they do? Well, one thing they did was they set up an institution called the hospital. A monastic order came up called the Hospitallers, and these Hospitallers would go and care for the sick and wounded. And many a person who might otherwise have died were brought back to health by these hospitals. And as a result, hospitals were set up in Europe. They gave us the institution of the hospital, and most of us at some point in our life will spend some time in a hospital if we haven't already. I did once, at least one of my children did spend overnight in a hospital. My wife spent several days in the hospital. Of course, all of our children were born in a hospital. Most babies these days are born in a hospital. Hospitals we take very badly sick people or hurt people and try to restore them to health. Again, it harks back to the Crusades. Banking was another institution that seemed to have gotten started largely as a result of the Crusades. But there's something else, folk. Thanks to events that happened just in the last couple of years in our world, we might be beginning to understand better. I mean, the human mind is prone to forget. We might be beginning to understand better why that our those of us who are European descent, our distant ancestors would feel compelled to go and fight the Muslims Again, I'm talking about the chopping off of people's head just because they're Christian, crucifying people just because they're Christian, rising up and taking over territory, holding hostages for money. This is what's being done. So, did Europeans, what we've forgotten about, did Europeans feel the pressure because of some of the excesses that were going on in the Muslim world, that they felt like they were compelled to go and quelch? Again, well, we don't have all the records. We don't really know. But in view of what's happened recently, I almost have to say, folks, that the Crusades were justified. It was a case of, hey, if we don't go to them first, they're going to come in and take over us. They've already taken over part of Sicily, taken over part of Spain, and are pushing in from the east. They're pushing in from the south, the west, and the east, and if we don't do something about it, they're going to take us over. And they might have, except that the Muslim world started fighting among themselves. So, my own personal view is, again, if anyone have any dissent, we have a couple minutes, I'll let you say your piece, that the Crusades were in fact justifiable. And I can say this perhaps with more strong conviction than I would have even a year or two ago, in view of what we all know is going on in the world right at the moment. All right. Now, out of the Crusades came a group, and let me tell you something, folks. This will be my closing remarks, and don't write this down. This will not be on the test. But a group called the Knights Templar. How many of you have heard of the Templars? They still exist. Okay, essentially, the Templars supposedly found a secret, and they started a new monastic order, but unlike the other order, it was a monastic order of knights, of fighting men. And they also set up banking and accumulated a great amount of wealth, thanks to, suppose they found a secret, and their secret might have been making money. But eventually, and I told you to mention this man against here he is, Philip the Fair wanted to join them one day, and when they, of course, being a monastic order, they only took unmarried men. Well, when Philip's wife died, King Philip, he felt like he could join them, so he asked for membership, and this is something you don't do. And they blackballed him. Well, he had 5 knights of his to infiltrate. He said, promise, take the oaths they promised, but when you're through, report back to me everything that they do in secret. And these knights reported some really horrible stories, that these people in secret were engaging in sex with each other, engaging even in sex with demons. I mean, folks, this is what the knights reported. Now, you can decide for yourself. Also, they reported that they had plans to overthrow all the monarchies of Europe, overthrow the church, and basically set up a new type of a new world that would be free of the church and free of kings, and set up a world where a person would get to be a leader by his abilities, not because he was born into it. Well, King Philip the Fair ordered that the Templars be executed. A bunch of them escaped to Scotland, where they helped Scotland get their independence from Britain, and supposedly sent their treasury across the Atlantic, and it's buried somewhere here. There have been many attempts to search for the treasure. It has not been found, but there have been some serious attempts to search for the Templar treasure. And as recently as January, there was a big series. The series ended a big series on search for the Templar treasury. Now, how many have ever heard this kind of story, folks? Okay, I have a few, not very many. Now, as far as the ideal nation these people hope to set up, they couldn't set up in Europe. Europe was too steeped in bloodlines and nobility. Then another group, the Teutonic Knights, tried to say the Teutonic Knights went up here in Estonia and Latvia to try to something. They couldn't. Instead, they had to go somewhere where there were no nobility and there were no nobles, no royalty. The ideal state that supposedly they set up, folk, is the United States of America. They changed their name from Templars to Masons, and most of you may know every one of our founding fathers was a Mason of sort. Well, actually, was active involved in Masons. Again, and the United States is a nation where that you become a leader by working your way up, picking yourself up by your bootstraps, and not because you were born into leadership. Supposedly, this would create an ideal situation, and that's one reason why that Philip wanted to destroy them. because it was either he destroy them or they would destroy him. Eventually, now thanks in large part to undermining, the King of France had his head chopped off. And other kings of France came along after him, but today France has no king, have a democracy again, and also the French Revolution had as its goal to eliminate all Christianity and all religion. This you'll find out if you study second semester world history. They failed. Eventually Christianity was brought back into France, but for a while it looked like France was going to completely eliminate all reference to Christianity. All right, anybody have any comments? I'm running over time. I've got to leave. See you on Wednesday.